Macbeth, we're going to jump into Act 4. So if the previous lesson was the cover-up, the lesson before that was the murder of the king, in this lesson we're going to see that the cover-up continues to have problems. In the previous lesson, in the murder of Banquo, his son Fleance escaped. In this act, the murder of Macduff and his family, Macduff, is not there, so Macduff escapes, so the cover-up is not going very well, and it demonstrates that theme of my actions. I can control those to some extent, given the nature of cause and effect, given the nature of influence, but my control over the consequences of those actions is very limited. So we see that here in this act. This act also has that ominous, foreboding atmosphere. The witches come back. We have thunder. We have incantations. It is frightening for the Renaissance audience, and we can think about in this act, I want to think about is the staging, the aspects of melos, which are the sounds, and the aspects of opsis, which are the things that we see, the imagery, and asking yourself, how would you stage this play? And I'll comment on that briefly. When we're interpreting drama that lacks stage directions, Shakespeare famously lacks stage directions, that can be a benefit and a detriment. The detriment is that, well, we don't know exactly how it should be staged and how the actors should, perform their lines. But the benefit is that allows for interpretation, that we the reader can imagine the costuming, how was it performed, where are the actors on the stage, and that control gives us great opportunities for interpretation. Finally, to finish the summary of the act is that in the latter half, we're going to have a conversation between Malcolm, the legitimate heir to the throne, the son of King Duncan, and his conversation with Macduff, who has fled to England, leaving his wife and son behind, and they will be murdered. Essentially, what I'll do in this act is I will continue to translate it into simple language, try to make some connections with our theme, and point out what I think are interesting quotations, interesting strategies. Although I will admit, I think in Act 4 there's not a lot really going on. But let's take a look at it. So Act 4, Scene 1 begins with a return to the witches. And I have to emphasize that we need to imagine this from the perspective of the Renaissance audience. Here is an aspect of melos with the sound, and they have a cauldron. And in this scene, they're going to be mixing together all of these ingredients for spells. But think about that for the ingredients that we put in, and then what is the outcome of those ingredients. We see some mystical aspects of a fable here with the number 3, which carries great significance. 3, why 3? 3 is the smallest digit necessary for a series. Also, 3 has suggestions of the biblical Trinity, but it's blasphemous in the spells, the sorcery, the magic of the witches. And keep in mind, witches, devils, that sort of thing is very real for a Renaissance audience. As you know, witches were burned during this period around the 1600s. Okay, so we have that to start. And I just marked here that we have all these rhymes. And it has this sort of sing-song nature to it, where it combines something so sinister with something that has that childish tone, which I think is frightening. It is frightening that something so sinister is presented in a childish manner, almost like a lullaby. But the lullaby here is frightening. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. It's frightening stuff. There are going to be people in the audience of this play fainting away in this scene. And it gets even more horrifying, frightening in its imagery as we work through it. So I marked this just to, this is a quotation that we can use to signify that the witches are engaged in sorcery. I love the stage direction here, where it could be, essentially telling the actors, just say anything that sounds frightening, black spirits, etc. Whatever might frighten the audience of that period. And think about that for yourself. What would be frightening to people today if I wanted to do a complete update of the play and make this incantation something that would frighten people today? Black spirits, etc. would be what? Totalitarianism, fascism, COVID-19, something like that. I marked this quotation because this is the name of a novel, a great line, but the name of a novel by Ray Bradbury. Usually read in grade 5. You could read it in middle school. It's a good book if you want to read it at any age. Anyway, there's what later becomes the title of a book. And then Macbeth steps in, and Macbeth is engaging with the witches, and he has some questions for them, because of course he's in an unstable and unsafe position right now. Things are not going exactly as he would hope, but the prophecy of the witches seems to be coming true. So he asks, what are you doing? And what they say here is significant, I think. A deed without a name. This goes to one of our themes of natural, unnatural, or natural, supernatural. Nature, language, knowledge, to name the world that we live in, to name ourselves, to have identity. What is that thing without a name? Something frightening, something that maybe Jacques Lacan might call the real. That outside of language is horrifying. Macbeth makes his demands here for answers from the witches, and it shows his arrogance, which we'll see later in this act as well. Perhaps it's Macbeth's fatal flaw, this arrogance that he has. And he's blasphemous in this scene too, when he beseeches the witches to untie the winds against the churches. This blasphemy, his begging for damnation, is frightening stuff. So this is where, as I mentioned, I think this is as I mentioned in the last lesson, this is sort of a Renaissance horror movie. So we have the thunder, the oral elements, and then this imagery. And how would you present this on the stage? So here I have an armed head. This is a disembodied head with armor on it, and it tells him to beware of beware Macduff. Then the next apparition comes, especially frightening, I think, is a bloody child. And the bloody child tells Macbeth something we've seen. None of woman born shall harm Macbeth, and this will lead to the twist in the plot, or Macduff was cut out of his mother. Then a third apparition, a child crowned with a tree in his hand, the crown as the royalty, the kingship, and the tree is a sign of growth. What is this? Well, this refers to Banquo, that Banquo would give birth to kings. Macbeth sees that in the images here. There's a show of 8 kings, and the glass in his hand is Banquo's ghost. And Macbeth interprets this image for us, that as he sees the kings appear and multiply, he sees Banquo there, and it's Banquo that points at them for his, which means that Banquo is the father of all these kings, which was the witch's prophecy. This whole scene for me is really, for the horrific elements, the foreboding, ominous atmosphere. That's how I would rely upon this scene for my own analysis. Then Lennox comes in. If you remember Lennox from the previous lesson, that Lennox was the one who I had said had shown this, that the cover-up was going well, that Macbeth had presented himself nobly, he had done what needed to be done. Lennox informs Macbeth that Macduff has fled to England, which of course shows the cover-up is not going very well. And here Macbeth, in an aside that only he can hear, he has a paranoia that time itself, right, and there's that arrogance, as if time itself cares about you or me, right, that time itself anticipates his exploits, that he takes some action, but somehow the mechanism of time is against him. Arrogance, but also it goes with our theme, right? We can't control the outcomes, and Macbeth's arrogance that he could control the outcomes, right? Maybe his fatal flaw, that he has an arrogance to command the witches, an arrogance to command time, arrogance. So, how does he want to challenge that? Well, you could interpret this as a sort of paranoia that I'm not just going to think about it, I'm going to act, not let them give them time to ruin my actions, and I'll surprise him. Yeah, I'll surprise him and surprise Macduff as well. So it jumps forward to Act 4, Scene 2. We have Lady Macduff, and Lady Macduff is wondering why has he left? And she says it was his madness. He's afraid. And Ross is here to comfort her and saying, no, perhaps it was wise for him to leave. But of course, Macduff has abandoned his wife and child, so she is attacking him. He wants the natural touch. What is the natural touch? Well, animals will protect their young, but my husband has not. He did it out of fear. He did not do it out of love. He did not do it out of wisdom or reason. He did it out of fear. Ross again tries to comfort her, and he has this rather stoic sort of line here. Things at the worst will cease or else climb upward to what they were before. In other words, well, things can't get much worse. Kind of the comforting he offers her there. This scene right here is with Lady Macduff and the sun. And this is an interesting scene because the sun is only in this play for a handful of lines. And what is trying to be accomplished in this scene? Well, Lady Macduff and the sun are about to be murdered by Macbeth's henchmen. So Shakespeare, in order to bring about an affect in the audience, he needs to make us care about these characters. And one that needs to make us care about is the sun. So in this scene, I marked this line because it sort of summarizes what's going on, is that the sun is being very witty and very funny. This right here almost functions as a comic scene. And I've mentioned this in previous lessons in my course on Romeo and Juliet, how within tragedy we need to have comic elements because we don't want to desensitize our audience to the horror, the tragedy. So since we just had that ominous, the scene of the sorcery and the witches and calling on, the devil and blasphemy, we juxtapose that with some comedy here. So it has a couple of functions. First is that it provides a contrast with the horror and the fear, the supernatural of the previous scene, and then also it makes us like the sun. If you read this for yourself, you'll see the sun is quite funny. He's funny in a few lines later as well. Let's just go ahead and jump over to that. This is where the murderers enter, and the sun says to the murderers right to their face, "Thou liest, thou shag-haired villain! What, you egg?" And then the murderers, no, they kill him. But again, we need to care about the sun for us to even care about this at all. So we have a natural propensity, it seems, to care for children. But also, this is a cute kid. He's a funny kid. We like him, and then he's murdered. Just previous to this is Lady Macduff has this great line down here. And this is not a new idea, but it's nicely said. "I am in this earthly world where to do harm is often laudable, to do good sometimes accounted dangerous folly." So here, doing something bad can be good, and doing something good can be bad. Well, we all know about this, and it's sort of a theological perspective of, theological question. If God is good, why is there evil in the world? That's called the Manichaean question. Or, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? What is the ethical order of the universe? That's one of the questions of this play, right? What is the ethical order of the universe? And I think that's a matter of how you want to interpret it. It seems that if you look at the evidence that I've been offering up so far, the order of the universe is essentially moral, right? I mean, that seems to be what the play is saying, because Macbeth acts immorally, and the consequence of those actions, he can't cover it up, right? He can't get out that spot of his immorality. So that's something to ask for a paper, perhaps, is the universe of Macbeth one of a moral order or not? What is the moral of the play? She puts up a womanly defense. The womanly defense is a pure passivity, to have done no harm, but even non-action can be punished in this play. Okay, so this is the last part of the play, and it's essentially a conversation between Malcolm and Macduff. I think that it would be more rewarding if students wanted to do a historical reading of this play of who's the King of England and what's the history of Scotland and whatnot. But I'm not going to do a historical reading. We're just going to do what's called new critical reading. We're going to just focus on the text itself. But that might be of benefit to you. Maybe I'll do an extra lesson on some of the historical theory around the play, if it's worthwhile. But here we have Malcolm. So Malcolm, if you check your cast of characters, he's the son of King Duncan. He is the rightful heir to the throne. And as a consequence of the murder of his father and the usurpation of the throne by Macbeth, Malcolm says we should just go and hide somewhere. And then there's Macduff, who's like, no, let's hold fast the mortal sword. Let's fight. Now, both of these people right here, Malcolm and Macduff, they don't totally trust each other. They both fled to England, by the way. So Malcolm says to Macduff, you had a good relationship with Macbeth, and he hasn't done anything to you. Maybe you would like to do something to me, harm me, capture me, kidnap me, whatever it might be, and you would offer me, the innocent lamb, up to the angry god Macbeth. Maybe that's why you're here. Maybe you're here to assassinate me. And Macduff's like, well, I'm not treacherous. And Malcolm doesn't really trust him. Macbeth is. And there is a bit of hope. There is an opportunity for Malcolm and Macduff to reconcile, to trust each other, because though the brightest fell, Lucifer, in Christian mythology, Lucifer falls from grace, falls from heaven, but angels are still good, right? So these lines here are just showing that even in the darkest time there is light, and light within individuals as well. Malcolm says here, I know that I don't totally trust you, but don't let me dishonor you. I want you to kind of show me that you're trustworthy. That's what this whole scene here essentially is them discussing their fears, discussing their hopes and aspirations, and trying to come to some sort of understanding of where the other is. So Macduff is saying, I'm not a bad guy. And Malcolm says, well, I don't trust you, but I don't totally not trust you, because right now our country, Scotland, is suffering, and I would like to do something about that. Maybe you could help me if you're trustworthy. Here in England, I've been offered some soldiers. We find out it's 10,000 soldiers to help him fight back and regain the throne. Scotland is not doing very well. However, Malcolm has a fear here too. Malcolm says that Scotland, it will suffer even more by him that will become king. And Macduff says, well, who are you talking about? And Malcolm, well, that's me. Malcolm, in this next section, Malcolm talks very badly about himself, about how he has all these vices, that he's not fit to be the king. So we have to wonder, why is Malcolm saying that? Well, toward the end of this section, Malcolm will say, I'm innocent, I'm young, I don't know much about the ways of the world. So it suggests to us that the reason that Malcolm thinks he shouldn't be king is because he has a lack of confidence and he's afraid, which makes sense because he's a young person. Do you want to be, the king of the world, king of whatever country? It's a lot of responsibility. He's afraid of it. Let's take a look at what happens. So he's saying, Macbeth, compared to me, Malcolm, Macbeth will seem pure as snow. Macbeth will be like a lamb compared to me, right? Macbeth might be all of these bad qualities, right? He might be all of this. But me, Malcolm, there's no bottom, none in my voluptuousness. I'll rape and destroy everything. So I would be terrible. And Macduff is looking at him in amazement. Wow, you can't control yourself. That's the tyranny of the self. This is the fall of many kings. So here Macduff starts to think that maybe Malcolm shouldn't be the king. So there's this distrust. This scene is about the distrust after the killing of the king, which makes sense, by the way. the king's been killed, the president's been assassinated. Do you trust anyone? I mean, not really. So this long dialogue between these two is trying to establish some trust in the chaos following the murder of the king, right? So Malcolm's saying, if I were king, I would do all of these terrible things. I would take the money away from the wealthy. I would destroy them. I would do all these things. And Macduff is like, well, this is this is bad. But Macduff here tries to assuage his fears that Scotland needs you essentially. Malcolm pushes back again. All these qualities of a king I don't have. So again, he's just making excuses or reasoning and rationalizing away his fear of being king and the burden of that. Macduff is, this is a very kind of nationalistic, patriotic scene, which makes sense because your country has been taken over, right? Through unlawful means. I mean, tyranny. Macbeth is a tyrant. So here again, nation miserable. Oh, Scotland, Scotland, Scotland. Scotland. And finally, Malcolm is overtaken by Macduff's nationalistic fervor, his patriotism for Scotland. And he says, this noble passion, it has reconciled my thoughts to thy good truth and honor. You and I, we can work together. We can work with God together against the tyrant Macbeth. And here's where we come to understand why had Malcolm said all those bad things about himself. It's right here. He says, I'm a virgin. I've never lied. I'm naive. I'm young. The first thing I ever said that was false was all those things I just said about myself. But now that he sees that Macduff is here to help him, he feels inspired. He feels he has a comrade, and he has the 10,000 men from King Edward of England. And then, so we have that basically Malcolm has come around to Macduff, and now it has to go back the other way. There's a realism here in the distrust, in the establishing of trust between these two characters. There's a realism to it. As Macduff says, such welcome and unwelcome things as once. The welcome being, I'm glad you want to be the king and you want to take your rightful throne and fight for that. The unwelcome is all those things you just said about yourself. Such welcome and unwelcome things at once. It's hard to reconcile. So there's some realism there. Do I totally believe what you're saying? And it complicates these characters. It's Shakespeare, of course. So here Malcolm says the king comes forth. This is King Edward, and King Edward is out there, and he has the mystical ability to heal people. He cures people. I thought that King Edward in the play sort of functions as a contrast to Macbeth. Macbeth is Black Macbeth, as he's called in just a few lines back, and King Edward is the pure saintly king. What king you might have. You could read it something like that. And there's probably some historical aspects to this that I'm not familiar with. So Ross shows up, and this is the scene that's very similar to the beginning of the play. So at the beginning of the play, you have King Duncan, and a soldier comes who's covered with blood, and King Duncan asks him, how is the battle going? It's very similar here. Ross shows up, and they're asking him, how are things going with Scotland, right? So we're getting second-hand information here. And look at the information, the way it's presented is quite interesting. What's the newest grief? Each minute teams a new one. Things are happening, right? Even as I am gone and here now, just like the soldier at the beginning of the play, things are happening. I'm only presenting you with information that I have, but already events are manifesting and changing. And here at the start, think about how you, as a director, would have Ross say these lines, because Ross knows that Macduff's wife and son are dead. And Macduff asks, how does my wife? Why, well, how would you say that line when you know that he's lying? And all my children? Well, 2. They were at peace when I did leave them. Why does he do this? He is trepidatious about giving this horrifying information to Macduff, but he lies at the beginning, and it's just soon, by the way, Macduff seems to be aware that he's not telling the whole truth, as he says right here. You know, how does it go, really? Right? Tell me the truth. And finally, Ross does tell him, let not your ears despise my tongue forever, which shall possess them with the heaviest sound that ever yet they heard. What is the heaviest sound that they heard? Your castle is surprised, your wife and babes savagely slaughtered. And this is terrible news, obviously. And Macduff is so overwhelmed that he can't quite believe it. He questions again. Ross says, yes, I have said. And now Malcolm steps in. Now here, Malcolm takes on the role of Macduff. Previously, Malcolm was overwhelmed by the loss of his country, the loss of his father. We should go hide in a desolated shade. I'm a terrible person. But now Malcolm steps in to inspire Macduff. Let's make us medicines of our great revenge to cure this deadly grief. Vengeance, Macduff, vengeance. Be this the whetstone of your grief. Let grief convert to anger. Blunt not the heart, enrage it. Revenge. So he takes on that role of Macduff here. And now they've come together, right? Macduff to inspire Malcolm. Malcolm to inspire Macduff. This is the end of the act. They have made up their mind. They're going to fight for Scotland, for revenge, to kill Macbeth. Come, we go to the King Macbeth. Our power is ready here on earth. Our power together in our relationship that we just rapidly built in this one act, in a few scenes, and also the power of heaven above, right? And then this final line of this act does fit in with some points made previously when we noticed light and darkness in the play, where Banquo is calling for a light, who's there? A friend, remember that? And then also the light and the darkness in the murder of Banquo, and how the darkness there allowed for the fleeing of Fleance, the ceiling night that hides, you know, the dark agents of the night. But here, as we enter into the final act of the play, this line, the night is long, it never finds the day, which would suggest to us from the structure of the sentence that day is coming and night is receding. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop there, and I'll pick up on Act 5. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them, and I will respond to you. If you like the video, give it a thumb up. I guess that helps things. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.